Well, hello everybody, and thank you very much for joining us. We are in fact celebrating the World Day for Cultural Diversity for Dialogue and Development. We have two very special guests and many members of our Cultural Diversity Committee. So I am going to start by, of course, acknowledging country. We are recording this panel discussion from the lands of the Darki young people here on the New South Wales Central Coast. And I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands from which you all join today, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in today's call. I also like to acknowledge the members of our Cultural Diversity Committee. We've got Marcella, Marjabeen, Helena, you can see there, Nicole, well done, Sarah, and of course Claire Beattie is as well, which is lovely to see. We are celebrating cultural diversity for Cultural Diversity for Dialogue and Development, which is held every year on the 21st of May to celebrate the richest of the world's cultures and the essential role of intercultural dialogue for achieving peace and sustainable development. And goodness me, if we look overseas at the moment, particularly around things like the Ukraine, I saw a very interesting program last night on how critical that is. The UN General Assembly first declared this World Day in 2002, following UNESCO's adoption of the 2001 Universal Declaration of Cultural Diversity, of course, which is now 21 years old, recognizing the need to enhance the potential of culture as a means of achieving prosperity, sustainable development, and recognizing global peaceful coexistence. And it's a day where they use to promote the culture and highlight the significance of diversity as an agent of inclusion and positive change, which is why we have convened this discussion. So without further ado, I am just going to say a couple of things. Please use the chat box if you've got anything you want to add. If you've got any questions while we're going through with Claire and Shirley's presentations, if you just want to note them in chat, that's fine. I will constantly monitor that. If there's anything that is the same theme, I'll start to pick them up. We are, of course, welcome to unmute in the discussion phase and have a look at that as well. But first of all, I'm going to invite Shirley into the conversation, and I've asked them both to speak on three topics to introduce themselves: where they grew up, their values and what impacted their life choices, career highs and lows, and how has being culturally diverse impacted their career. Welcome, Shirley.
Thanks, Claire. Great to be here. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Camaragal land, and I pay my deep respects to elders past and present and thank them for their ongoing love and care of this land. So I grew up here in Sydney. Before I came to Sydney, though, I lived in a diverse range of places. I lived in the Netherlands, Sweden, Israel, England. And then as an adult, I went back and worked for a New York law firm and worked out of Asia for 10 years. So I think that the kind of not only cultural diversity from my own ethnic background, which is Indian, but that kind of being open to cultural experiences has helped me navigate a lot of my life and career. I'm thinking of this, sorry, I'm just looking at the questions. I started off as a lawyer, so I feel really fortunate to have had a number of different careers. I had a traditional legal career, so started off after doing law here, doing the New York bar exam and working with a top tier New York firm, and then working with them in Asia, so living in Japan for 10 years, and then becoming regional general counsel for JP Morgan Investment Management. And then I think I always became a lawyer to make a difference, and working for big corporates, that wasn't happening. So I switched and worked for the not-for-profit space for a long time. And that culminated in me being CEO of Adam Goods and Michael O'Loughlin's organisation, the Go Foundation, which is about supporting Indigenous students. And now I'm running a portfolio career. I sit on the board of the Australian Associated Press. I'm chair of an advisory board for a health tech startup. And I'm doing some consulting in the not-for-profit space, trying to raise capability and capacity. And I think the thing that has driven kind of my whole career is connecting people, place, and purpose. And I think that cultural diversity piece, I only really became aware of the power and the value of that in the last 5 to 8 years. I think before that, it was really about trying to fit in and trying to be the same as everybody else. And I think that's really shifted for me in recent years.
Thank you very much, Shirley. People, place, purpose. Love that as a continuing theme throughout. Claire Beattie. Welcome, and over to you for an introduction.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the kind acknowledgement of country. I'll introduce myself properly by saying Gupagaka, Yorta Yorta Waka, Ngartha Claire. Many of you know me as a proud Yorta Yorta woman, and I don't use that term too lightly. I'm a proud Yorta Yorta woman, and my totem is the long-necked turtle. Any of my staff that are, or my team members, the people I work with, not the people who work for me, if they're online, they know that it means I'm a long-necked turtle because I stick my neck out for mob, and I've got a hard shell if you want to have a crack, which is perfect for infrastructure where I work. But of course, I'm meeting today from the lands of the Darawal people whose totem is the whale. And I tell everyone that it's because I want to be a whale when I grow up. She moves things with her own tide. She moves things, doing things with people, not to them, which is very much the true essence of government. And that's where I work and have been working for the last 24 years. Very much like Shirley, I believe in being the change and making a difference. My career has been a series of lateral shifts, so has my whole life. I was born in Papua New Guinea, in Lae in Port Moresby. I came to Australia and was ironically naturalised as a First Nations person. My father was a navigator bomber in World War II and served over Papua New Guinea, so he chose to bring us to life there. And then we returned to Queensland under the Joh Bjelke-Petersen era, which was obviously not the best political environment for First Nations peoples. His son-in-law actually was my pastor at church, so it was a very interesting environment to grow up indeed. I went to university and I did a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology, Communications and Law. I did a Bachelor of Education and I did a Master's in Psychoeducational Assessment Malpractice Law, but I also have degrees in Project Management and also in Traffic Engineering. Why do I say that? It's because all of those things were built together with a really big why. None of those things did I imagine ever going together. A teacher who builds tunnels, who now works in school infrastructure and was recently the relieving chief executive of $15 billion worth of stuff, was never my intent growing up. I'm on the board of the PCYC because I believe in helping young people. I'm on the board of WageEc because I am a person who campaigns against domestic violence and believes that women and children should have a safe place to go. But most importantly, every time I find there being a person who needs to stand up for stuff, a person who needs to do stuff, whether it's my job or not, whether it's a policy position, whether it's actually a tunnel that needs to be built, I seem to find myself getting another degree or finding some sort of training or finding myself in that job. I also worked on the Sydney Siege just because I happened to be there in the Transport Management Centre on the day that that happened. So my auntie says spirit provides, and I really believe that. If you believe in being the change, you'll find a way to be resilient and you'll always find a way to make a difference, just like Shirley was talking about then. So I think anyone on this call who's thinking about joining a board, connect it to your why. Only join boards that you believe in making a difference on, because it's a lot of work otherwise, and you'll never work a day in your life if you actually connect to your why. So that's who I am.
Thank you. Love that. You never work a day in your life if you actually connect to your why. I totally agree. I think it's amazing philosophy to live by. I'm going to start with you, Claire. What does cultural safety mean and why is it important?
It's so important. I think that everyone comes to work expecting to leave work either feeling the same way they started, so hopefully they start happy and they finish happy, or even more enriched as their day goes on. Now, WHS is something that's treated very, very seriously, particularly on work sites and in infrastructure where I work. But people don't understand that psychological damage and emotional damage and trauma is just as hurtful, and if not ongoing, as if you fall down a pothole and you twist your ankle or something more serious. So psychological safety and cultural safety go hand in hand. It's very important as leaders and as team members, as workmates, that we understand that diversity and inclusion is not a bumper sticker. It's not something that you just throw around and you think you've got it. There's a big difference between equity and equality as well. And I invite you to have a think about what those things mean. But in terms of my psychological and cultural safety, it is about not being a diversity target. I was the first female Aboriginal relieving CEO of school infrastructure, not because I was the first Aboriginal female CEO. I was Claire Beattie, and because I'm an executive director, I get to act up as the chief executive, just like my other peers. So psychological safety is about creating an environment where you feel safe enough to be yourself at all times, authentically yourself. You don't leave parts of yourself at home. I can't scrub off my skin and make myself white. So I bring my best self to work. And that is all the things I know as a First Nations woman. That is the sayings that my auntie says, spirit provides, in an environment where I say spirit provides. And now my boss, God love him, says it in environments too. It is about being safe to speak your truth, even if your voice shakes, and knowing that your peers will have a debate with you that's respectful, that isn't pushing back on you because of their unconscious bias. It is about feeling safe enough to be able to acknowledge when you've got something wrong or something right, or ask a question. Excuse my Malachi, otherwise known as a dog in my language. It is about making sure that there are other people around you that are from a similar culture, because there are certain things you can share with people from your culture in a safe way. So if you're the only Aboriginal person in a workplace, 99.9% of the time, you will feel like an outlier. And that's not anything other than making sure that there are people there that understand you and recognize you without having to unpack yourself daily. And psychological and cultural safety is more than an acknowledgement of country. It's more than words and more than everyone doing a rap, because quite often a rap is not an answer to anything unless you're actually walking in true reconciliation with people from First Nations. It is about knowing what you don't know and admitting it, and working as a true ally. I'll admit the things that I don't know if I feel safe. You'll admit the things you don't know if we feel safe, and we can debate things in a mutually respectful manner. There is nothing worse than feeling like you are a token or you're there to meet a diversity target. No one wants that. No one gets out of bed for a handout ever, and I'm so against that. It is also about people understanding that there are going to be differences, and asking you polite questions, not doing one of those drive-by cultural awareness bits that I get sometimes in lifts. Hey, Claire, I'm on the corner of blah and blah. What country am I on? Or can you teach me how to do acknowledgement? So all those things make me feel psychologically and culturally safe, but it's just about being friends. If you can be friends with the people you work with, you have everything.
Thank you. Thank you. Shirley.
I agree with so much of what Claire has said, but I think for me, the most important word that I think of when I think of cultural safety is authenticity. Because the truth is that at the end of the day, every single one of us, regardless of where we come from or who we are or what our background is, we want to be able to take our authentic selves into the workplace. And we don't want to have to change that according to who we're in a room with or who we're in a meeting with or who's there that day. And the best example I give of cultural safety is, again, like Claire, thinking of reconciliation action plans. There are two types of reconciliation action plans in my world. The first type is where the company makes a big fanfare, they put in a wrap, and then it sits in the bottom drawer other than for 2 weeks a year during NAIDOC week and reconciliation week. And for the other 50 weeks of the year, the message to any Indigenous First Nations person who works in that company is that you are not important. You are only important during the weeks that it is important for us to look like we're doing something. And so I think cultural safety is about looking at the policies, the procedures, the unconscious biases, the structural barriers in an organization to make sure that they are actually welcoming of everybody. And I recently had an experience where it was very clear that this organization needed a diverse view around the table. If you looked at who was at that table, it was very homogeneous. But actually, the truth was they didn't want a diverse view. They just wanted to be looking like they were doing something different. So when diversity actually spoke up and said something, it wasn't welcome. And I think it's though, we could spend an hour just talking about that question, but it's those things you need to look at as an organization. Who's on your board? And I know that's the next question, but who's on your board? Who's in your management? It's the what. What do you say through your policies and your procedures and what you celebrate and what you say yes and no to? And it's the how do you do it? Do you do it in a way that makes everybody feel like it is a safe thing to speak up if things make them feel uncomfortable? Or are people just not going to speak up because they don't have that sense of cultural safety?
Wow, some great responses there, and you're both right. We could talk about this for half a day. This is a whole workshop to unpack unpack this. Shirley, you have been, and this is a really interesting question for you, because cultural diversity, why does it matter in board and leadership roles? I was really interested that you were the CEO on the Go Foundation, which of course we all know the history behind that. So why is it important to have cultural diversity there? And I'm talking to Claire's point around the fact that it's not just about the whole token thing. I think as women, a lot of us get that because, of course, 16 years ago when we started, that was the kind of mantra. Why would I go there? But some of them had to be trailblazers. A lot of them were trailblazers. And so why is it important to have that cultural diversity on boards and in leadership roles?
I think you need to look at, it's not automatically important, and I'll explain that because there'll be people in the audience who will bristle at that comment. If you are an organization that's making a widget or providing a service, and you are only providing it to one part of society, so say you're making a widget for white men over 60, well, all you need on your board is white men over 60 because that's who you're selling to. But, you know, there are, I would say, almost no products that fit that definition. And if you are selling a widget, for want of a better word, and you want a diverse population to buy that widget and use that widget and talk about it, then you need those people making the decisions in your organization. So whether it's at kind of a pipeline level where people are doing the marketing and writing the words or thinking about how to sell something, whether it's at the senior management level around the C-suite table or whether it's on the board table, if you don't have the varieties of lived experience, then you are not doing your organization a service. And the McKinsey data backs this up completely. If you have diversity around your board table and in senior management, your financial figures are better, your productivity is better, your innovation is better. Like, to me, that's the reason everybody should do it. You know, if you've got shareholders and you've got members and you've got people looking to you to make a profit and do well, then if you don't have diversity, you are not actually servicing those people properly and you're not doing your product the best service that you can do. So I think that's the most basic reason. But I think, Claire, on top of that, there are all these reasons that get layered. We have a population here where 60% of our population hail from a family that came here, you know, that speaks a second language. We've got First Nations population of over 3% that have no representation on most boards and organizations. We don't represent who we are in our boardrooms and senior management. It's just the right thing to do. We can't continue to have management that doesn't reflect who we are as a country.
It's interesting that you say that. It's back to the you can't be what you can't see as well. And I'm always reminded of the role model effect, particularly when Julia Gillard became Prime Minister and the impact that had on young women around the country particularly. Claire Beattie, over to you.
Look, I think we build schools. So in school infrastructure, we plan, build and maintain schools. And my team do a lot around sweating the lazy asset that is a school. But I can't serve a community or serve a young person or serve the parents of the young people. I can't serve my customer if I don't have a bit of everyone in my team. So I look at my team constantly and think, who am I missing? You know, do I have every person from every community here? And if not, I am proactively trying to find that person, because I don't want to be paternalistic accidentally, ironically, to a community and white parachute in and say, here's the problem you have, I know how to fix it. I don't come from that community necessarily, or from that language speaking group. So how can I possibly fully understand and come in with empathy and work with that community, not doing things to them, and not make them distrust government even worse than how they feel already, because I know exactly how that feels given the policies of the past. So for me, it is about, as Shirley said, you have to represent your customer. You have to have a bit of everyone. That creates diversity of thought. Some of the best projects I've ever delivered, the St. Helena Tunnel project, it was delivered on time and on budget and with a perfect safety rating because we had a bit of everyone. When I first started, we had an echo chamber of middle-aged men who all came from operational environments, ex-military, ex-police, etc. And they all agreed very, very quickly answers. But they weren't thinking about innovation. They didn't consider other risk factors. When we started bringing in bits and bobs of everyone, yes, it seemed like it slowed down. It certainly frustrated them, but we came to answers that were more innovative, and we delivered on time and on budget. So I've seen real examples of where diversity and inclusion changes a project, both its safety targets, its ability to meet deadlines, its ability to deliver. It's real. It's not just something that people throw around. It could be nice to do. It's best practice to have diversity. In terms of where I work today, on our executive, we have people from a variety of backgrounds, and because I feel psychologically and culturally safe, I can pull on any of my brothers or sisters on that exec team. It's not Lord of the Flies, which you find in some executive environments, and I've lived in those executive environments where you don't dare ask to share your homework because someone's going to steal it and get an A and a star from dad. But it is about making sure that we've all got a bit of everything. I can ask any of them a question about asset maintenance, or I can ask them a question about architecture. I can ask them a question about civil engineering, and know that there is someone on that team who has a wealth of experience that can help me with that exact project. I have a teaching background. I'm the only one exec with that. So they can ask me about what does real life in a school look like, so we don't accidentally do something to a community that isn't going to work. So it is all around that idea about we need to make sure that we have diversity and inclusion on boards and in the work environment to best deliver. And to me, there's only one thing worse than mansplaining, and sometimes that's white mansplaining. So we need a little bit of everyone to make sure we avoid that as well.
Claire, can I just add something?
Yeah,
Sorry,
sure.
something that Claire B just said. I think there are two sides that we need to acknowledge to this argument that diversity is important. The first is that this is really hard. It's not easy. And if you are a leader in an organization today, to have to think about gender diversity and think about cultural diversity and having somebody with a disability there, or thinking about all the different segments you have to include, is hard. So I'd just like to acknowledge that this is not easy. Nobody's expecting that it should be easy. The second thing I think is that as people who are aspiring board members, it's not enough anymore, I don't think, just to think about the fact that you have a diverse cultural background. I always say to people, you have to actually kind of tunnel down further and think, if you are in a lineup with 20 people who looked like you, who had similar lived experience to you, what makes you stand out? So I think there's two sides of that. It's difficult for both sides.
And I think that's a really interesting point. I'm just going to pick up too on something that Claire said as well. Claire, how did they react to you? Aboriginal woman coming into the infrastructure team. Infrastructure teams are notoriously, white male. And so how did they respond to you?
Look, I know I'm a unicorn, so I expect to change the dynamics of any room that I happen to grace with my presence. But I think it was a lot worse. In 2015, when I was building the St. Helena Tunnel, I turned up as the first female manager ever in traffic operations history of New South Wales. So I turned up as the manager in a bunch of older males who, did call you toots, who still had interesting paraphernalia on their desk that may or may not have underdressed women that they asked if I was any of them or was related to any of them. You were met with all sorts of daily things like, your perfume's distracting. I used to say, well, it's deodorant, you should try it. So it was a little bit about bringing a sense of humor to it. When I first came into that environment, I created above the line and below the line behaviors because people understand sport. These men understood sport. So above the line was what I was going to appraise. So if you said something, if you cheered someone on, if you're a good teammate, if you looked after each other's safety, all those things, above the line behavior, well done you. Below the line is calling me toots. Below the line is talking about anything about my personal appearance at all. And I just, without saying you're an ist, I would say that was below the line, and I'd hold steady. After a while, they started calling each other out on it. So they weren't calling each other horrible names on site. And they'd say that was below the line, mate. And they'd stop. And all of these things started creating a bit of a wave of, it's okay to say when that hurt. It's okay to say that's not all right, but I'm not calling you an ist and I'm not being confrontational. And after a while, the CEO of RMS, Ken Konofsky, actually took on the behavioural charter that I created for that environment because he wanted diversity and inclusion across all of RMS. And it came with unconscious bias training as well, because you might like apples more than oranges, and that's okay as long as you don't hate oranges. So we talk a lot like that. When I first came into school infrastructure as the first female, I have no doubt that some people in the organisation thought Anthony Manning had adopted a golden Pokemon, and then he could win awards or hold me up as, look, you know, we've done a reconciliation action plan in the department. Mark Scott drove that in the department, and I had the privilege of, as the Director of Strategic Communications in a previous role, driving that RAP, which Treasury and Transport actually took on board some of the framework for that. So people knew me as a bit of the RAP girl. She's the Aboriginal girl. They didn't know I had a background in infrastructure. They didn't know I'd been there for the Sydney Siege and driven that. They didn't know I'd delivered a tunnel. So there was a lot of proving oneself, which is unfortunate. Sometimes you have to work longer hours. You have to show your degrees. You have to be resilient. You have to, as a Black woman, sometimes people are very quick to pigeonhole you as an angry Black woman when you're being assertive. Whereas if you're a white male, you're a leader. And I think that's still true. But what I've learned actually from the cultural and psychological safety of my boss, and I know I could wax lyrical about him because I really believe in him, because he really believed in me. He took anything with the word Aboriginal away from me in terms of work. And he gave it to people who weren't Aboriginal. And he asked them to get enough training and enough awareness and enough support from me and others to make sure they could deliver the thing, because Aboriginal agreement making is important for finding archaeological remains and things like that on site. We're working with Aboriginal communities. So I'm not the SME for all things Aboriginal, certainly not. People had to know how to do things themselves and learn how to fish. So he created that. And when he took all those things away, it allowed me to be Claire Beattie, Executive Director, not Claire Beattie, Aboriginal woman in infrastructure. So I think that was an important step for him to take, to make me psychologically safe, to make sure that everyone didn't think it was my job. I still to this day get emails, people asking me to copy edit their acknowledgement of country from different parts of government, not just Department of Education. And I still get a lot of weird and wacky questions because it has the word Aboriginal. Maybe I would know how to do it. But it is getting better. And I think having relieved as CEO 3 times now, it does change that thought bubble that, you know, this is Claire and I'll treat her like how I would Anthony. I'll go to her with the same questions. I'll brief her in the same way. I think it does help position, but it is a battle. It's not easy. It's tiring. It is psychologically tiring sometimes to be a person in this space, because you're all things to all people. You have lateral violence against you, sometimes from your own people. And sometimes people really do just think you're there because you're a golden Pokemon.
Thank you for sharing that, Claire. I'm going to just divert now and go to a question, because it touches on the issue that Shirley brought up around it being really difficult. And it's to Denise's questions, which Lakshmi has added on to. Diversity does create issues for people because of unconscious bias. What do you recommend to facilitate the lessening of that unconscious bias? I think we just had a couple of examples from Claire there. Tiredness, there's tiredness around the unconscious bias, and even in some cases sabotage of it. And Lakshmi has said, how can bias be unconscious? There is quite a lot of work around unconscious and conscious bias, Lakshmi, and so that's something that is sort of recognized. But Shirley, I'm going to ask you if you would pick that question up, because you of course obviously worked strongly in this with the Go Foundation.
I think, look, just to the second part first, there is absolutely unconscious bias. And if you haven't done it, I'd encourage you to go to the Harvard website and you can type in Harvard unconscious bias test, I think, and it'll come up. And when I did it, I was quite embarrassed and shocked that I had unconscious biases too. We all have them. It just comes from your lived experience and how you've grown up and where you are. Once you know about a bias, it's no longer unconscious. It's conscious if you're still executing on that bias. Look, I think there absolutely are environments, I've worked in them, we've all worked in them, where you feel like you can't say anything because people are fed up of hearing. And that comes back to that issue of psychological safety and cultural safety. I think I would hope that and I know that there are some organizations where this is not the case, but find the champion, find somebody you can speak to, because I think that's really important. Having an outlet is really, really important. Whether it's your boss or your boss's boss or somebody else at a different level, find somebody you can confide in. I think most organizations these days do want to get better. They genuinely do. They just don't always know how. That's the approach that I've taken. And so I think there is a way to have these conversations and, you know, from a place of respect and non-judgment, even though you're feeling very judged when you're in that position, I think it's really important to have these conversations in a tactful way, because as Claire has already alluded to, people do get their back up. People feel like it's a accusation of racism, and it's absolutely, it can be two very separate things. So I think look for those people, have the conversations, have them in a really careful and tactful way, because no doubt you'll have them again and again and again. And ultimately find your people. Like if that's not the organization where they're appreciating you, you are enough. You just have to find the organization that believes you're enough. And I'm a big believer in that. If it's not the right organization, find one that is. And I know you can't do that overnight, and not everybody has the luxury of being able to move jobs without the next one. I totally understand that. But there are lots of good organizations doing great work out there.
Thank you, Shirley. Claire, anything to add on their unconscious, conscious bias conversation?
I think we all know intention. So if I said to Shirley, hey, what are you drinking? She'd tell me if that was a cultural drink, right? And she'd explain it to me, because my intention is to find more out about Shirley, because she's my friend. But if I went, what are you drinking? She'd be like, oh, wow. All right, then. I'm not going to tell you so much because I don't feel safe right now. We all know the difference in intention. You know in your gut when someone is being some sort of ist to you. So the below the line stuff I like. My favorite phrase is, can you unpack that for me? So if I feel into my waters that you are not being my friend and you are throwing shade at me and you are trying to attack me, you're trying to make me unsettled, you're trying to do something that's not good human behavior, be a good human, it's not hard, then I will ask someone to unpack that for me. So Claire, how Aboriginal are you? Can you unpack that for me? And just allow the silence, that beautiful, juicy silence, to occur where the person's brain catches up with their mouth. And they might go, oh, bad human, bad human. What I meant was, what mob are you from? Cool. That's not what you meant, but we can have a chat about that. But if they were being a bad human, can you unpack that for me? In a room full of people, there is nothing juicier than everyone going, oh, damn. Whoa. Double dog dare you to get yourself out of that one. No shovel in the world's going to save you now. So if they're being like that, feel strong enough just to ask the gentle question for them to unpack it, and just sit in the beautiful, juicy silence that is. They won't do it again, and they'll question it, and they won't hurt the next people. The next person that we're going to say something silly to, they'll question themselves, and they'll maybe stop themselves from hurting someone else. So I would think to those things. And the champion stuff that Shirley spoke about too, I've been really, Spirit provides, Arnie says, and it's true. Spirit has provided that I have had a lot of non-Aboriginal allies and champions that have understood that I am a weapon of disruption. At times, I will disrupt thought for the greater good, to say, have you thought about these people? Have we thought about this change? Have you talked to these people? Have you actually talked to these people? Or did you just run in and get the answer that you thought? I've had a lot of champions like Mike Pratt, who used to be the Secretary of Treasury. He saw me and straight away understood what my love language was and where my belly week was. And he would go into meetings and white-splain stuff to other white leaders and bring me into forums. And I never would have got a ticket to without that guy and his connections. I hitched my train to his wagon accidentally, and he wanted me to. He used to call me his mentor in places, which always used to make my ears just burn red. He'd go, this is Claire Beattie, my mentor, and this is the head of Treasury who used to run banks. Like, what? I've been very lucky to be adopted by people who speak the same language as, you know, your average white male. And so they can go in and champion me, sell me, tell people what I do, get on board with what I do, make it easier for people to understand it and make them feel safe with getting involved with it too. Because some people have white fright, that's okay. Some people, you know, are too scared to lean in and jump in because they're not sure they're allowed to, or they're too afraid to ask questions. And when they see people of that leadership caliber leaning in, they'll jump on board too, because they're for the greater good as well. So it is that, as Shirley said, that and you can see Shirley and I continually doing this. Be the echo chamber, do that Michelle Obama thing, do that Hillary Clinton thing, where if a woman says something in a meeting, don't let the man take away the woman's message and mansplain it. Don't do it. So if Shirley said something and another person explained it again, I'd go, as Shirley said, Shirley had a really great idea. Back your other females in. Say it again and again and again. Their messaging, their name, back it in. Don't let other people reiterate what they said. There's nothing worse. We've all had it in a meeting where someone said exactly what you've just said, but they happen to get taken up as being the idea person. It was Shirley's idea. She's too deadly. She's amazing. That girl has got it. She said it. What she said. Learn to do that.
Interesting. Of course, we lost the great proponent of that earlier this year in Madeleine Albright, who said a special place in hell for women who don't support other women, or a variety thereof. Yeah. Question, what policies or past or actions of the past do you think we should all be aware of here in terms of healing and reconciliation? Because that's what we're headed towards. You're both glass half full people. So, you know, what actions should we be aware of in moving forward? Claire, I'll go to you first.
So we had a policy in New South Wales called the Clean, Clad and Courteous policy. It was in 1972, which isn't too long ago. And what it meant was that there was a feeling in policy world that Aboriginal people were not clean, clad or courteous enough to be educated in the state of New South Wales. So it was up to the principal to fight for that child to be educated. And we wonder how we got to closing the gap. It meant that a race was started, the gun went off, and we weren't allowed to race. It led to, when that policy was abolished in 1972, that a lot of Aboriginal parents still came and got their child halfway through the day and would redress them, reclothe them, make them try and look clean, clad and courteous, so that they wouldn't be taken by the services, because there was a lot of feeling that they would be removed. A lot of parents still to this day don't feel comfortable going into schools because they fear that their child will be removed. They fear that they're not clean, clad and courteous enough to step into a school, or they never went into a school in the first place. So hence it's very hard for them to support their kids with their educational needs when they come home, needs to help with homework. They don't attend parent-teacher nights because they don't feel safe in those environments, because they weren't welcome in those environments. So my job in school infrastructure is to make sure that every community and every child is known, valued and cared for, inside, outside of school and by the school assets. So we're partnering with First Nations people, with community, to build safe places for mob to come in, aunties and uncles to come and yarn, for kids to feel proud of where they've come from, and for non-Aboriginal people to also walk with us and understand that. So obviously that policy of the past led to some of the closing the gap issues we have around education. So we didn't do this to ourselves. There's something to understand. Something also that came out of the Black Lives Matter piece, where people were turning their Instagrams black and thinking that would change the world, was that, do Black lives really matter? Or do they just matter when something bubbles up and people, you know, are really angry about it for 5 seconds? Because we still don't have treaty in the state of New South Wales. Not that that's a silver bullet, because in New Zealand they have, if not worse than us, education and death incarceration rates, and they do have treaty. But it would be nice to have that discussion across jurisdictions. And lastly, I guess, during the Black Lives Matter, there was a journalist who was in New York who said we never had domestic slavery like they had in USA. Well, that's not true. We had domestic slavery here for the longest time. As I said, I grew up in the Joh Bjelke-Petersen era, in the day where still my dad wasn't sure I'd come home each day. And there is still that anxiety around, you know, children being taken, languages being removed. There are languages that we still can't speak because we'll never speak them again because they're gone. And we have obviously the stolen gen survivors. When I was working in Aboriginal Affairs, people wanted to call it compensation, reparations, compensation. How can you compensate for the atrocities and traumatic experiences that these people had done to them by being removed from their families, and worse than that. So I guess we're still not fully healed. We're walking towards that reconciliation process. Some people are trying to console, not reconcile. Some people are still trying to find out where they come from. And that means everything. Country is everything. My country is everything. I take my shoes off. I put my feet in my mother. My mother is country. She gives me everything I need. She heals me with everything I need. To sing your own songline, to be able to find your way home means everything. And if you can never find that, then there are bits of you that will always be missing, that may never heal. And so there are still intergenerational trauma that occurs from the atrocities of the past. But I'd point you to the clean, clad and courteous policy, because that happened within my sister's lifetime. And I was a kid that grew up in care with 27 homes. So you cannot tell me that we are past the stolen children generation.
Thank you, Claire. Shirley.
I am still reeling from the clean,
Yes.
clad and courteous. So thank you, Claire, for sharing that. I think we haven't owned our history in this country, and there is a harsh period of truth telling that we need to go through, not just mainly in relation to our First Nations people and their ongoing care of this land for over 65,000 years, but also in relation to our migrant population, things like the White Australia policy. And we don't talk about our history enough. The fact that people think we never had slavery in this country, as Claire said, the fact that people think that the stolen generation is something that happened decades ago, so it should be done. We have, through our history, created deep-seated trauma in parts of our community that we need to own. And so I think that, to me, is really the work of the next decade. It should be done sooner, but I suspect it will take longer. And everything from, if you haven't read the Uluru Statement from the Heart, I would encourage you to go and read it. It is the most generous invitation from our First Nations people to all of us to walk in this movement for reconciliation with them. And we need to be prepared as individuals, as organizations, as families, and as a country to have these conversations that will take us to really uncomfortable places. But without going there, without having those conversations, we can't understand. And we're going to continue hearing things. One of the phrases I used to hear all the time was, yeah, but an Aboriginal student can get into uni easier than me, so why do they need help? But what that statement ignores is that we have imposed 200 years of trauma on our First Nations people, and we don't own it. Governments continually shirk their responsibilities. We don't have treaties. We don't have even a Royal Commission looking into truth telling. Like, we haven't moved there yet. So I think that's the most important thing. But for me, there's the First Nations piece, but there's also the other pieces that are attached. It's the same principle that joins all of those policies. But I think there are people in this country who still struggle to deal with government, as Claire said, to go into office buildings, to leave their children alone, all those things.
I think, thank you, Shirley, and thank you for echoing. It's an incredibly powerful statement that Claire made. I'm reminded when you both spoke about conversations that really the last time we did this in a very big national way is when the Gillard government had, I suppose, the courage to set up the inquiry into child sexual abuse and how long that went on for, and the terrible stories that happened. A number of people at WOB were part of those processes, and they left their jobs after 2 and 3 years because there was only so long that you could actually sit in those spaces for as commissioners. But the catharsism that came out of that really terrible the terrible truth telling around those traumas that happened to people. We haven't done that, Claire Beattie, in the same way for the experience of our First Nations people, have we?
Look, I think truth telling should be a big part of RAPs, to have aunties and uncles The trick to it is to do it in a trauma-informed way. The
Yes.
Healing Foundation does some really great trauma-informed pieces, because there's nothing worse than people pulling out an auntie or an uncle and not giving them support on the way home. They've just told them something horrible and they're going home to what? And they're not paid for their services. They're not getting a taxi ride home, all those things. But I think the stolen gen reparations with the apologies is part of it.
Thank you. Questions? I'm just monitoring the chat here. Some great comments from people, but does anyone have comment, question? Does anyone else want to share an experience that they've had? Because you're very welcome to do so.
I just wanted to say, Claire, sorry, I've got a bit of laryngitis, that I'm just blown away. Thank you, Shirley and Claire, just really touching. I'm a migrant, but I think there's a lack of knowledge. It's the education piece. And, you know, what resonated with me with Claire, I've always been afraid to ask, not because I'm malicious in any way, but just because I don't know the right questions. And I think we are lacking. It amazes me how much history we study at school. But when I did high school in Australia, not primary school, but I learned nothing about our First Nations people. And I think the lack of education of everyone and knowing the questions and knowing what to ask and just being armed is the first step.
Claire.
Look, sis, I think what I said before about intention goes a long way. It's not about framing it properly or thinking about it too hard, but if you come to me with the right intention, if you're my friend, Sarah, and you want to ask me a question, you want to have a yarn, you'll do it at the right time. Like I said, the drive-by shootings that happen to me all the time in lifts, where all of a sudden everyone wants me to answer everything, but they don't really know me. And so it might be, oh, is your Nana stolen gen person? You're asking me that in a lift and I don't know you. Wow. So, you know, there's the extremes of those things. But if you've got time, you want to have a cuppa, you do it in the way that your auntie would, sit down, have a cuppa, everything happens over a cuppa, and we spend time and we have a good yarn and we find out about each other, because I want to learn about your culture too. And it works both ways, right? And then we're being friends. So if you come with the intention of being a friend, it's okay. But in education, we are fighting now. We've got the Language Rejuvenation Act, where we're bringing languages back that exist, a lot of them don't, into schools. We've got aunties and uncles coming in. We've got, you know, the schools do reconciliation really well because the kids drive it, which I love. I've got kids who can sing the national anthem in their language, which I love. The kids that are growing up in this generation know more about country than I ever got taught, which I think is a blessing. I think they're getting it right, this younger generation. You know, they're okay with gender neutral and all the other things that, you know, didn't exist when I was growing up, but they're certainly more kind and generous and open-minded. I find this generation, and people of my age who have had kids now are standing up and saying, I'm a proud. This is new. This is new. In the last 5 years, you hear people saying, I'm a proud Bundjalung man. I'm a proud Yorta Yorta woman. Like, you know, it's about deadly. We brought in language that is ours and gives us empowerment. All this change makes a big difference. And to hear white allies use it and see us as a strength, to not ask questions like Shirley said, where people, you know, I went to uni, I didn't get scholarships. I didn't do it on purpose. I remember standing in Centrelink trying to get youth allowance. I forget what it used to be called at uni, but there was Aboriginal allowance and youth allowance.
Something start, I think.
And, they told me that I was in the wrong line because they knew I was Aboriginal, but it was the same. They paid the same amount of money. So I don't know why there were two lines. Like, it made no sense. I'm not in an identified role because of that. Some people wish to be in identified roles, that's fine. But I've my whole life never been in an identified role, because I never want anyone to say I got there because of. Because once upon a time it wasn't okay to be one, and now it seems like everyone wants a black handbag. I'm just going to get there on my own.
Claire, Claire's just raised a really interesting point that I've come across a number of times in organisations. We shouldn't expect people from a culturally diverse background, including our First Nations people, to be the arbiters of culture, of that culture. You know, it's so dangerous to assume that every Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person in an organisation will be able to answer every question you have. That's not how we should get those questions answered. And actually, during COVID, I am aware of a law firm, which I won't mention the name because I don't think it was public, but they paid every Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employee a cultural loading, because that organisation acknowledged that during COVID in particular, they put a heavy burden on those younger employees in particular to help with the wrap, to front up on a panel, to do all those things. And so they got a cultural loading, which you don't hear about in a lot of organisations, but I think it's just, we just need to be aware of it. So it's not unconscious. You're not doing what Claire suggests and, you know, in a lift saying, hey, by the way, you know, do you know the answer to this? That's the first comment. The second comment I would make is at CBA, they did something really innovative. I don't know if there's anyone from CBA on here, but in one of the IT teams, it was run by an Aboriginal man. And so what he did is once a month, he would run a session called Ask Me Anything. And it was a safe space where he was prepared, and it has to come from him. You can't impose this, you know, on somebody. But he created a safe space where people could bring their lunch for an hour and they could ask anything. As long as it all goes back to Claire's intention. And, you know, he said, there is no such thing as a stupid question, ask me anything. But what it did is it broke down barriers and it created understanding. And a lot of people haven't met a Muslim person who wears a hijab or a First Nations person. And so these Ask Me Anything sessions can really help to create understanding.
Thank you. That's a lovely tip. One last question from Nicole, and then I'm going to go to Marjabeen for a vote of thanks.
Thank you. Great presentation, Claire and Shirley. Wonderful. And just following on with what Sarah said, I think part of the fear is that when we don't know the answers, we're scared to appear ignorant, and because we think we should know. And so there's that fear of when you're outside your comfort zone from a cultural understanding. I think from the other side of it, that's where the fear comes. And I think breaking down the barriers on the other side, that it's like you said, you can ask me anything, which is a great example that there's sort of no silly question as long as it's respectful. And I think that will help develop understanding. That's just sort of what I've gauged. But yeah, great presentation, ladies. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. I'm going to, I'm getting some feedback here. I'm going to ask Marjabeen, who chairs the Cultural Diversity Committee, to do a vote of thanks.
Thanks, Claire. I guess, you know, cultural diversity, you know, it's not a simple, straightforward thing to solve. And clearly from today's discussion, we know a lot of work has to be done and ongoing. I guess, you know, the cultural diversity does bring the different lived experiences that we have, different perspectives, and more importantly, to Shirley's and Claire's point, so important to create awareness of your own stereotypes, your own biases as well. And finally, I guess key takeaway for me is really to, you know, the education piece is so important. We need to make sure that people around us, whether it's our colleagues, it's board members, they're completely aware that, you know, cultural and linguistic differences may impact, you know, your communication. And how do we adapt? How do we say something without not impacting the other from a different culture? You know, you may say something, but, you know, a person of a different culture might interpret it completely differently. You know, so I think that's something we need to be, you know, and there are a multitude of cultures that we deal with day to day in Australia. So we need to really figure out the sensitivities of that. And that's quite a lot of work that needs to be done there. So with that, I guess, on behalf of the Cultural Diversity Committee, I would like to thank Claire Beattie and Shirley Chowdhary for really sharing your meaningful and valuable insights today. It was a great session. And also not forgetting a warm thanks to Claire Bront, Ruth Med, Nicole Donegan. These are my colleagues at Women on Boards. And, you know, for really taking that first step in establishing a committee like the CDC with the aim to, you know, address these barriers to opportunity for TALT women, giving, you know, opening doors for us, and really not just focus on obviously your gender diversity side of things, but really to dig deeper into advocating for the cultural side of things as well. Participants, thank you all for joining today in this very important discussion.
Thank you, Marjabeen. Thank you, everyone. I only echo my pleasure in saying it's been both a privilege and a pleasure, and very humbling, Claire and Shirley, to have you both on. So WOB is at the beginning of this journey, but we're very committed to looking at the cultural diversity and how we actually really engage much more solidly with that within gender for us. So thank you both.